What is up, guys? It is Quinn here, back with another fantasy football video. And over the next 2 days, we're going to be going through some of the biggest fantasy football risers and fallers in terms of ADP. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about 5 players who are rising up the rankings. They're going earlier and earlier in fantasy drafts, and just kind of talk about them as players, break them down, discuss kind of whether I like them at their new ADP, if I think they're going to keep rising. So all that sorts of stuff. Before I get into the first player, if you guys enjoy the content, do me a huge favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. You guys know the deal. But let's jump into the first riser, and it is going to be Saquon Barkley. So he hasn't taken a huge jump, but we're looking at a guy who's going in the first few rounds. So even moving up like 4 or 5 slots is pretty significant. So earlier in the offseason, like even a few weeks ago, Saquon Barkley was going like early, mid-third round. Now he's jumped up to more of a late second round selection, going as like RB11, RB12. He's basically back to back with Leonard Fournette right now, and he has pretty firmly jumped players like Nick Chubb and Javonte Williams. And so it seems like people are buying back into the talent here. We know there's some risk here, but this is really like a risk reward play. There's definitely some red flags, but we know the ceiling is so high because when Saquon Barkley is healthy, when he's 100% himself, he's a high-end running back one play for fantasy football. I mean, the dude averaged 24.1 PPR points per game as a rookie. That is top tier production. He's one of the only running backs in the NFL who has like a legitimate shot at going for 1,000 rushing yards and 1,000 receiving yards in the same season. You're looking at guys like Christian McCaffrey. He has done it before. Maybe a guy like Austin Eckler could do it. But if Saquon can stay healthy for 17 games, that is totally in the realm of possibility. Obviously, the risk comes from injuries here. He has suffered, significant ankle sprains in both 2019 and 2021. Those ankle sprains haven't necessarily led to him missing a ton of time. I think he missed 3 games in 2019, 4 games in 2021, but it definitely limited his production coming off of them. So he was playing through the injury or, coming off of it, but was just not the same player. And then we all know he tore his ACL in the 2020 season, was kind of coming back from that in 2021. And the problem here is that some of these other guys who have these injuries, a player like Christian McCaffrey, when he would return from injuries, he would be his normal self. Last year, he was hurt all the time, but he would come back, put up like 25 points, then get hurt again. But he would be this cycle where he was still putting up top tier numbers. The problem for Saquon is that he did kind of experience a drop off in play last season. So coming off of that ankle sprain, he only averaged 10.5 PPR points per game after returning. It's not a great look. He didn't look fantastic, did not look like the same player, but I'm not going to, ding him too much here because the whole offense was horrible. It was just not a good situation here with the Giants. Heading into 2022, this offense definitely looks much better, at least on paper. They had a ton of injuries last season. Hopefully this team is pretty healthy going into week 1. You have Brian Daboll coming in. He's actually talked about wanting to use Saquon as a wide receiver. I just think that's great news all around for fantasy, for his real life production. If you can get this guy receiving work, he's going to be taking less hits from these massive defenders. You get him out in the slot. We know he's a capable wide receiver. I think that is great news for him as a fantasy football asset. So really, I think his upside is very high. If I was going to kind of project where Saquon's ADP goes from here, I feel like he's either going to stay around this like pick 22 slot, late second round, or I think he's going to move up. I don't see him falling back down into the 3rd round. Obviously, in a certain number of drafts, he probably will go early 3rd. When we're talking about like average draft placement, I don't think he's going to go back to a 3rd round pick. I think the upside is there. You're not taking the same risk that you have in previous years where you're taking him in the 1st round. So I think he's either going to stay as like a back end 2nd round pick, or I think he could rise a few slots, maybe start to kind of make his way into the middle of the 2nd round. So that's what I think about Saquon Barkley. Another running back who is rising up in terms of ADP, that is Travis Etienne. I talked about being a big fan of Etienne at his price. I think it was like a few weeks ago. And basically ever since I made that video, no correlation here, but his ADP has definitely been on the rise. Now he's going as like a mid 4th round pick. I don't hate this price for Etienne, but it's definitely not as juicy as it was like a few weeks ago. So he's definitely no longer a player who I'm like actively targeting, going out of my way to get him on my team, because I just don't think this price is like insane where it was, really nice a few weeks ago. It seems like people are really kind of coming around to Etienne as being the clear RB1 on this team. I know people really love James Robinson, but that Achilles tear just really opens things up. This workload could be right there for the taking for Travis Etienne. It also looks like the Jaguars are going to be giving him opportunities in the slot. Just like I talked about for Saquon, that's great news. We know Etienne has the receiving abilities. That's going to give him, a new level of ceiling for fantasy football. And if this ADP continues to rise, I'll likely be out on him just because I think you can take a guy like Breece Hall, like half a round or a full round later, and it'll be better value. But here in the mid fourth round, I think it's fine if you like him at this spot, but he's definitely not the screaming buy he was, just a little bit ago. Now moving over to the wide receiver position, we have Mike Williams really kind of rising up draft boards. His ADP has gone up all the way to like mid third round, and he is going back to back with Keenan Allen. I definitely thought there would be more of a separation between those two guys, but I mean, it kind of makes sense. In 2021, he was the wide receiver 12 in half point PPR points per game. It was by far the best season of his 5-year career. I know some people are probably going to hate this price for Mike Williams, and I don't necessarily blame you. I can definitely see the arguments people are going to make against him. You can say last year was a fluke. It was so clearly the best year of his career. Maybe he regresses back to what he was earlier. He also fell off towards the back half of the season. So can he put it together over an entire season? These are all valid arguments, but in my opinion, this was a different coaching staff using him in a totally different role. In previous years, he was used basically as like a deep threat. He was going to burn you down the field. He was kind of going to be a big play guy. If he had that 40-yard touchdown, he was going to produce for fantasy. If he didn't, you were kind of out of luck. So this is his average depth of target, his ADOT, over the last 4 years. So 2018, 15.4, 2019, 17.4, 2020, 14.8. Those are very, very high. Then here in 2021, only 10.7. So that is a total role change in this offense. So I don't really think it's fair to compare last season with his previous years because it's really just not the same player. I mean, I guess it is the same player, but it's the same player playing a totally different role, which obviously is going to change things for fantasy. And it was successful for the Chargers. So I imagine he's going to be doing that same thing here in 2022. For me, he's probably a little too pricey at this ADP, but I don't think it's like a crazy spot to have him. He's likely an ascending wide receiver on a top-tier passing offense. He's attached to Justin Herbert. We know Herbert's a stud. And then you have Keenan Allen, who's been the wide receiver 1. He is 30 years old, just kind of playing devil's advocate here, because I do think Keenan Allen is still clearly the better pick for fantasy, but definitely something to think about with Mike Williams. It's possible he does overtake Keenan Allen this year. I don't think that would be a crazy thing to happen. Now, staying here at the wide receiver position, we've got Rashod Bateman. He slots in here as wide receiver 25. And earlier on in the offseason, he was kind of going in the same range with the young wide receivers, Darnell Mooney, Elijah Moore, Amon-Ra, those guys. Now he's jumped that tier, and he's even going ahead of some proven veterans like Brandon Cooks, Amari Cooper, Juju, Chris Godwin, all of those guys. I'm a big fan of Rashod Bateman. Loved him coming out as a prospect. Was a big fan of him basically all through last year. He was always on my waiver wire pickups. I was waiting for that rookie season breakout, but I kind of feel like we've gone a little too far on him. I think he's definitely going to go later than wide receiver 25 in more like casual leagues, but more hardcore leagues, I could totally see him being like a fringe wide receiver 2 pick. But in my opinion, this slot is just a little too early for me to draft a wide receiver who hasn't really broke out yet. He didn't break out last season. And I do understand that he can be the wide receiver 1 on this team. He most likely will. But you're looking back at last year, the argument is, okay, he's the wide receiver 1. Marquise Brown was balling out before Lamar Jackson got hurt. He just slides right into that role. Personally, I have a few problems with that argument because we just straight up don't know if he's as good as Marquise Brown. He obviously wasn't able to compete with him last year. There were factors, kind of contributing to that. Missed early chunk of the season. Tough to, kind of get that chemistry when you're injured and training camp, all this stuff. So I do understand that, but I also just don't think this is going to be the same pass-heavy attack. The Ravens have always been a team, at least with Lamar Jackson, they're going to run the ball a ton. They're not going to throw it a lot. Well, in 2021, they kind of had to throw it a lot. 35.9 pass attempts per game. We had the injuries to their running backs, J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards. The defense was banged up, so they really did have to throw the ball. So 35.9 pass attempts per game. That was the ninth most in the NFL. You go back one season, 2020, they only averaged 25.9 pass attempts per game. That was dead last in the NFL. So if I had to bet, what side they're closer on here in 2022, I bet they're closer to that 25.9 number. It could be like 29 pass attempts per game, 30, but I'm just not seeing a situation here, barring, more injuries to the defense, injuries to the running backs, where they're closer to that like 36 pass attempt per game number. It just doesn't fit their personnel. They have not invested in pass catchers. They trade away their wide receiver one. Why are they going to be pass heavy again? We know the run game is very successful with Lamar. So Rashod Bateman here, wide receiver 25. Love the player. I want to have a few shares of him, but he's definitely not someone I'm going all in on this year because, it's kind of pretty hefty draft capital. If he misses, or even if he is the wide receiver one, like he could be the guy and still be like wide receiver 30, wide receiver 31, and then you're kind of disappointed in that pick. Now on to the final player, Trey Lance, the only quarterback on this list. I've talked about him a bunch recently, so I'm not going to go super deep in this breakdown, but his ADP has kind of slowly started to rise, is now going in the 8th round. I think it just makes sense. People are starting to understand, he's gaining traction due to his pretty high ceiling with that rushing upside. I think he's a legit dark horse to finish as the QB1. I would not be surprised if he was like a top 3 quarterback. So I think he will likely continue to rise, especially as we get closer to the season and Jimmy G either gets traded, cut, whatever happens. Like once Trey Lance is announced as the starter, his ADP is going to jump even more, and I think he's going to have that starting spot. So if you're drafting early or you're doing your best ball leagues, I'd be taking advantage of a guy like Trey Lance and snagging him on your rosters. So those are the 5 players who are rising in ADP. Just to run through them again, we have Saquon Barkley, Travis Etienne, Mike Williams, Rashod Bateman, and then Trey Lance. So those are the 5 guys I talked about at the beginning. I'll be going through the fallers tomorrow, so be on the lookout for that video. Thank you all for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.